All right, welcome fans to a special edition of Florida Focus, a college football podcast. I have a special guest with me today. This is Canada from thecollegefootballpodcast.com. By the way, Canada, how did you guys get the name for this show?
At a wedding, San Diego, California, and you're okay, three buddies, okay, we're going to do a podcast. Okay, let's come up with a creative name. And then pre-planned for the episode, everything ready to go, couldn't come up with anything. And then just, this small playoff like the Ohio State University, pretty lame, but we figured just get it out there, go with it. And then it just kind of stuck. So
that's awesome. Well, it's better than the U, which not a fan of them at all. So
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for making the time today.
Yeah, not a problem.
The reason this kind of started is because you guys cover the Pac12, big Oregon Duck fans, and kind of a crossover, of course, of Willie Taggert. So we'll kind of get that a little bit if you don't mind. See where you're coming from and a lot of the perspective there. But as fans of the college football teams in Florida, I had a couple of questions, if I could, just your perspective from the West Coast. From the West Coast, from Northwest, what does the West Coast kind of see the ACC and SEC as? The Atlantic Coast, the SEC, Southern football. What's the perception of us out there?
I think you have two schools of thought. I think there's the honest West Coast fan, and then let's call them the biased West Coast fan. There's no doubt it's completely different. Like you step on, I've been to games at Tennessee, Michigan. Obviously, they're super into it, but just everything about college football is slightly different on the West Coast. Like people care about it out here, but it's just slightly different. So I think off the bat, the passion is not night and day different, but for somebody to say people in Portland care about it just as much as people in Orlando, they're absolutely kidding themselves. It's just simply not true. So the level of passion is just a little bit different. In terms of the specific landscape of college football, I think most people will give the SEC, certainly in my mind, the SEC West, a leg up on kind of the rest of college football, and most people will be pretty honest about that. I think the ACC, people certainly respect Florida State. People certainly respect Clemson. But after that, I think most people would view college football as the separation between your Virginia Tech and your, let's call it Stanford or Oregon or Arizona State for that. So the difference between those schools is not that far. And I think, something even like North Carolina plays Cal. It's interesting. North Carolina has their own struggles this year, but it's tough to find a big difference once you get outside that top 10.
Okay. I think that's pretty fair. I think even in the ACC, where Florida State's kind of run over the conference up until very recently, that there's a drop off there between those programs, so that's pretty fair. And yeah, you get that kind of bowly matchup like when your Florida State played UCLA. It's not one you see very often, and so pretty good. So is the SEC as good as they think they are, or as we think they are?
I personally, I have two issues. I have a ton of respect for the SEC. Again, it's hard to knock what the SEC's done in the last 15, 20 years of college football. Now, I think it's fair. They always get the benefit of the doubt. If they're back in the BCS era, how many times was the SEC representative in the BCS championship undefeated? Pretty much maybe one or two times in that 10 or 15. Don't exactly quote me on that, but there's a ton of times where it was in Alabama who had a one loss against name the other school, one loss, the Alabama team or the SEC team got the benefit of the doubt. So I think the SEC has a certain built-in advantage in terms of they'll get the benefit of the doubt. Again, this was a lot bigger factor when we relied on the BCS, which was a factor of the polls. So when you started the season with 5 teams of the SEC ranked in the top 15 or whatever, it actually made a big difference. Now it's a lot less important. And I don't know if we should necessarily kind of in the this year or the last, maybe we'll call it 5 years, is it really the SEC or is it really Alabama? I think if you were to take Alabama out of the calculation, the dominance of the SEC, I think, would be a lot more in question.
That's a great observation. I mean, you can even go back to a time, the early 2000s, when USC was dominating. An undefeated Auburn team in 2004 doesn't even win the national championship. They finished number 3. And so it's hard to imagine that. And Saban comes in, I think in 2008 was his first year, or 7, excuse me. So that's when the SEC started to change. Somebody pointed out to me, at least with like the Florida Gators, you see that their defense has never really fallen off, with a few exceptions. But their offense has. Why? Because they're adjusting to Saban. And the whole conference is kind of bowing to what he's doing. So, yeah, I like that take.
Yeah. And, you look at the Miami had their years, Florida had theirs. It's really, there's been one massively dominant force really for the last 10 years, with obviously some teams cycling up depending on, you had your Cam Newtons at Auburn or whatever it may be. You really at Alabama was, whether playing for the national championship or within one game of a national championship, pretty much, for the last decade since Saban's been there.
Yep. All right, cool. Well, thanks for clarifying that. Biggest rivalry west of Texas. What do you think of that?
Like, I hate Washington like absolutely no other. In terms of to be honest, west of Texas, I would put Oregon, Washington really, really close up there. Like, for example, Oregon State, it's little brother, big brother. Oregon's not cheering for Oregon State ever, but the animosity towards Oregon State is nowhere near the level of animosity towards Washington. It is a deep-rooted hatred of epic proportions. And again, maybe it's, but that level of hate is Alabama, Auburn, Michigan, Ohio State, whatever you want to do. And, certainly UCLA, USC, there's hatred there, but also, you kind of question whether people really care about USC football. That's the difference out here. It's most fans of USC, they're probably bigger Laker fans, or they're probably, bigger LA Rams fans or LA Dodger fans or whatever it may be. Certainly in the Bay Area, there's nobody I've met living in the Bay Area that is a bigger Stanford or Cal fan than they are a fan of whatever else. Certainly, obviously, there are Stanford and Cal fans out there, but they care about something else a lot more. Oregon, Washington, you will get a fan base of people who care about Oregon football more than anything else, and certainly same thing with Washington. So my answer, I'll give you Oregon, Washington, a little bit biased, but there's definitely a good degree of hatred there.
Okay, that one usually is not played at late in the year. Middle season, probably October.
Yeah, certainly it's not a set date. The Apple Cup, which is Washington State, Civil War, Oregon State. That's the traditional last game of the year. So it's there's been years it's towards the start. This year, I think it's early October. It'll be a pretty important game.
Okay. All right. Your opinion, who do you think the best team in Florida is this year so far?
Can I go neither? Or none of the above? Usually you get the I will say, if I had to pick one team I would not want to play, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I think the team I'd least want to play would probably be Miami. But I just can't tell you what South Florida is. I have no clue. I'm not a Charlie Strong guy, so let's just put them aside. Of the big three, I think the team with the most, look, all of them have massively stubbed their toe so far. But the team, I would say maybe on paper should be the best would be Miami. But again, Malik Rozier has not been competent in quarterback in the last probably 10 to 12 games. So unless he's going to remember how to play football like he did for the first 6 games, beating Miami would not be that scary. But it's just, why Texas isn't good at football and why the Florida schools aren't dominant. It baffles the mind coming from Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, the same. I think Georgia's stealing a lot of recruits. You're seeing that. I mean, they just beat down South Carolina. And so that can make some difference there. If I were to throw in like UCF, any fear there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mentioned this on our podcast. There's such a Oregon feel to that, where you had an elite coach, an elite quarterback, and then you'll bring in the new coach. He's going to look good for a year or two, and then slowly, steadily, you'll realize Josh Heupel's not the answer, and Mackenzie Milton is by far the best quarterback in Florida, and maybe certainly one of the best quarterbacks in the country. You're a classic kind of not NFL guy, but borderline elite college quarterback. Yeah, I got a lot of respect for them, but I do think that's a program that will slowly fade back as the shine off Milton and Frost kind of wear away.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree, mostly because the conference they're in, the American, which was what is left of the Big East, you just don't see any consistency. If there's anyone to point to say you've been the most consistent, it would be UCF. They've won, I think, 5 conference championships in the last 10 years, something like that, even back to George O'Leary. But you don't see from year to year, like Tulsa doesn't repeat. UCF, I think, only repeated once. And then you got the Houstons and the seemingly unknowing teams that come out of nowhere, like Navy or Memphis. So there's just too much parity in that conference to
like SMU's had his some moments. I'm really against Sonny Dykes, but and I don't like the coaching staff at Cincinnati either. But those are two programs that if you put the right guy in there, you certainly could win. So it's a fair point. There's a lot of programs. I do think the Florida schools and maybe to a certain extent Houston, SMU have some built-in advantages, but it's not one of those cases where you have a behemoth which it just has this inherent advantage over everybody else.
Okay, excellent. The other question I had is just Pac-12. Does the travel, how much you guys have to fly and drive everywhere factor into, okay, these guys are coming back from a long road trip, maybe a Thursday night, short turnaround. There's certainly not nearly as much in the SEC, but in the ACC, since we added like Boston College to Miami, literally the entire Eastern Seaboard, that can factor in sometimes, but that's always been the case for the Pac-12, right?
Yeah, and it's been, so I think there's two issues, and this is actually quite controversial in terms of the scheduling and how other conferences, certainly the Big 12 plays a lot of these games in terms of making the road a little bit easier for your bell cows of your division. I think SC last year had to play a road game, I think it was like at Cal on a Saturday, and then play at Wazoo, which is an impossible place to get to, on a Friday night. So now the Pac-12 has this deal. They got a bunch of Friday night games, and they don't do anybody any favors with those Friday night games. Usually you would have the Thursday night game's kind of a bygone era, but the ACC played a ton of them back in the day. You certainly would have a bye that preceding week before that Thursday night game. The Friday night game, now they don't give the team the bye, part of the ESPN deal. And I think Washington has a game like that this year. Certainly USC when they lost to Washington State last year. So it's a bit of an issue over here in terms of the scheduling. Your team you try to get to the national chamber or the playoff, you're giving them kind of an added disadvantage against not only the rest of the country, but certainly the rest of the conference, which is a concern. So, yeah. And then on top of that, the biggest issue, and this is my biggest gripe with the SEC, and it does really piss me off, is the 9-game schedule versus the 8-game schedule. The fact that a team like Alabama, they played one difficult non-out-of-conference game. They always play at a neutral field, and sometimes it's against a middling team like Louisville. But that gives them enough credit. Nobody will ever blast their schedule. They play 3 cupcakes the rest of the way. A team like Oregon, it just happens this year, they play 3 cupcakes, but then they'll play 8 BCS, Group of 5, or Power 5 conference teams. Same thing. Alabama's going to play 8 Power Conference teams. Those should be weighted equal. If for some reason Oregon has success this year, they're going to get blasted for their non-conference schedule, but nobody weights at 8 versus 9, I think, adequately enough in college football.
Yeah, it's weird that they didn't swing that way. Maybe it's, they're trying to tighten up their wins and keep the streak going. Maybe that's part of it. I was kind of surprised. Coaches like Les Miles came out and said, well, we should do 9 teams because that way a guy that plays 4 years, if they play 4 years, that's not really the case anymore because there's so many transfers and NFL talent that leaves. But in theory, a 4-year guy would actually play every school once.
Yeah.
So
and I think NFL is starting to see this. A lot of other sports, college football is going to very quickly learn. I think, and attendance was down these first 2 weeks. You just can't put these crap games out the first month and expect people to go to them. It's just, I think people are going to put up with 1, maybe 2. The reality is I got too much to do. I can follow the stuff on my phone. I can watch this thing on TV just as, me and my buddies, we've really morphed to, we'd rather just all get together and watch 27 games on a weekend than pay a ton of money and be stuck in a hotel room and you maybe catch 1 game in the morning. You go to the tailgate, you do that whole 9 yards. That's all great. But, you watch 3 games versus 25. I'm certainly not doing that unless that game I really, really want to see. So I think for me as a fan of college football, it doesn't help anybody to watch Alabama beat up on some Sun Belt team.
Actually, a quick comment about you're talking about traveling the game, getting a hotel, and it's a lot of the bigger cities in Florida, and you can define big however you want, I'll put it in air quotes. They have so many other sports distractions, like you were mentioning in the Bay Area. Miami falls victim to that. Everybody's a Hurricane fan now, but it's the Marlins when they're good, or it's the Heat when they were winning. Orlando has the parks, and they have so many other things. The Magic when they're good, the downtown's blue. Now they're not so much. But now everybody's kind of jumping on the UCF bandwagon. And that's unfortunate for the team because, they've been the only college presence in the Central Florida area until, USF joined in 2000 or the early 90s and then had a good season in 2007. But yeah, it's certainly the case. But they have like Tallahassee and Gainesville, much smaller cities, right? So you go there, you're there just for the game, and your fanhood doesn't sway too much because of that.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a very metropolitan base. Again, like Miami's a perfect comparison to the kind of I would describe West Coast college football fan. Vast majority of pretty much everybody lives in a major city where you have that alternative if you want.
Sure. All right. Well, one of the things that drew my attention to your show, obviously, was the coverage of just the national scope, but also mainly of Willie Taggert. So I'll let you kind of start off. What are some overall thoughts of him or some of his strengths or some of the changes that you saw from like year 1 to year 2? So I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah. So I'll go. So just stepping back, Oregon goes to their just quick background, Florida predominantly focused podcast here. Just a quick little aside, the background history of Oregon. You had Rich Brooks, Mike Bellotti, Chip Kelly, Mark Helfrich, basically head coach, offensive coordinator. You had that lineage essentially from like 1987 or something. So you really had a model that basically worked really, really well. And it totally disintegrated in year 4 of Helfrich. And I was actively cheering against Oregon to get rid of Helfrich. So I was completely convinced, and I think most of the fan base looking back on it, that thing was utterly broken, total tire fire, destroy it, time for a change. So it was a massive, you essentially took, and the assistant coaches, most of them were there for 10 plus years. You had guys there who were there for 30 years. So it was a massive upheaval from a cultural standpoint to a schematic standpoint, and just to kind of a history standpoint for the program to make the decision. And to be frank, the first choice of Chip Kelly just didn't work out with the 49ers. Timing was a little off, whatever. So they would Taggart. I think that was, in my mind, probably the best choice of the alternatives out there. Is kind of PJ Fleck was that year. Jeff Brom was out there in terms of a guy, I think it was a very logical pick. So for me, day one, in terms of my evaluation I think from a cultural standpoint, getting the team energized and some juice back into the program, you got an A+ on that. It was, It felt fun again to be an Oregon football fan. So he did all that stuff really, really well. Now, all that stuff, when you look back on somebody leaving after a year, it feels really, really fake. So just, I think it's tough to say, okay, well, he built up this culture here in Oregon. Well, he's going to do the same thing and get everybody motivated, because it's, how much is that true? How much of that was BS type stuff? So it's a bit of my kind of concern, and like, how's that raw stuff playing in Florida State in the context of leaving after a year, and does it just fall on deaf ears to a certain extent? But in terms of, just to be fair, he came into a pretty bad situation. I think he did turn it around. The team on the field certainly was undisciplined. There was a ton of penalties, but when he had his quarterback, they played pretty well. Certainly much better, and they looked competent. The record, I think it's probably fair to throw most of it out, because Oregon was playing a true freshman quarterback who he's got a few snaps as a true sophomore and hasn't looked much better, and is unfortunate for the kid. There's no reason he should have been in there, but it's just the reality of numbers. And this will relate back to this podcast. The backup quarterback was supposed to be Terry Wilson, who transferred to a JC, now is at Kentucky, who just led the Wildcats to the big victory at Florida. So everything in life comes full circle. But yeah, though, again, like, if he was there and Herbert gets injured, he's playing, who knows what that record would be, or they're in a better bowl game and Willie decided to stay, who knows. So on the field, it's almost like an incomplete. Like, it's hard for me to really give a big assessment to the fact that Herbert got hurt, but there was some energy to the team. And lastly, off the field, from a recruiting standpoint and a building the coaching staff standpoint, he got an A+. It's kind of, before he played a game, everything felt really good. We just didn't know how on the field it was going to go. And after year one, it's hard for anybody to really kind of equivocally say he was a massive success or a massive failure. There were good moments. There was it was just really tough to say due to the injury to Herbert. But most Oregon fans, I think pretty much all Oregon fans, were cautiously optimistic going into year two. When you looked at the recruiting class, Oregon was sitting at the top 7-ish, top 8-ish recruiting class into December. Certainly would have closed much better if Taggert were to stay. There was a lot of positive momentum going into it. But then him leaving certainly left a lot of people very, very angry.
Okay. Yeah, so two thoughts quickly. I think you answered some of the questions that the fans had, just the Oregon perspective, if you will, and how he recruits well and how he sets up the staff, and is his record indicative of, is he a game manager versus, is he just kind of a CEO, if you will.
Yeah.
Can you go back, Canada, to the leading up to Taggert leaving? What was the feeling around Duck Nation when the biggest complaints were anything from the news circulating he would leave?
Yeah, so basically there's an aspect of Rob Mullins. This is the guy who chose not to go after Chris Peterson, chose to go for Mark Helfrich, who was the kind of handpicked guy after Chip Kelly. A lot of this is just partly my kind of thoughts. Anybody could have read the tea leaves when you saw Jimbo flirting last year, was don't give this guy an out to go to Florida State. Certainly when he had a successful first 6 games of the year, and potentially there could be this Jimbo situation, lock him up. So by the time Oregon started discussing kind of contract extension, it was already too late. So by that point, Oregon had already, I think they won a game against Utah, a game against Arizona, a game against Arizona State. So they won their last 3 games. They got to a bowl game. Everybody's feeling quite positive with the direction of the program. Recruiting was going great. And then it became very, very apparent that Jimbo was leaving. It was that awkward moment. Was he going to coach that last game or not? He had one foot out the door. A&M by that point had fired Sumlin. The dominoes, anybody could very easily put them together. Oregon offers him a contract, doesn't seem to accept it. And it's awkward for anybody. And the reality is that, I can't kill him for going on the recruiting trips. And, he famously, sat down with a recruit in the morning and then basically flew to Tallahassee and signed the deal the next day. It was all in all a terrible look. And a guy who, see, again, if you're kind of lay low coach, it's like you're Mike McIntyre at Colorado, nobody's going to care if you pull that off. For Taggert being so boisterous with the rah-rah stuff, all the sayings, do something, no excuses, blah, 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 blah. All that stuff doesn't sound good when you're basically like lying to kids. By that point, everybody knew what was up. You had to have had these discussions. It was a bad look, no way about it. So, how could he handle it better? I don't really know. The only way he handles it better is not leaving. Right. And the one comparison, kind of in my mind, in modern times, is when Todd Graham, when Tulsa, Pitt, Arizona State within 2 years. So basically, you can leave one program, nobody's going to care. You just can't skip town 1 year later, and people are going to be pissed if you do that. Mm-hmm. And there's not that many precedents of people skipping after 1 year from a major program. So, there's really no way he's leaving, and people are remotely saying, well, he did it the right way. So it was going to be a bad look either way. Oregon people, I think, are justifiably pissed about it. My perspectives are RAD screwed up massively by giving him a contract, which is easily able to get out of. And at that time, at Central Florida or South Florida when he's leaving, Oregon had all the leverage. They could have said, whatever poison pill to force him not to go to Florida State, you could have put in that contract.
Yeah, I'm just along those lines with Jimbo Fisher, and I'll get to Taggert in a second. He comes in as the offensive coordinator in 2007.
Yeah.
Bobby's at the end of his career, but he's been the coach since 1976, so there's no opening. And this is around the time Taggert is kind of looking around, and he becomes a South Florida a little later on. But there was not going to be a coaching search at Florida State. We knew who the next head coach was going to be. He took less money to stay, whereas he could have been the head coach somewhere else. So it was just a matter of when is he going to push Bobby out. And a lot of Florida State fans kind of see him that way, unfortunately. I personally don't. I kind of saw it coming, and and when Bowden couldn't remember players' names, I was like, it's time to move on. So let's just do that. But you have Taggert kind of waiting in the wings saying, I've always been a Florida State fan my entire life. The opportunity is not really going to present itself. They're good with Jimbo. Bobby was there earlier on. I'm going to take this job. There was no indication a year ago that Jimbo was going to leave. There were rumors swirling like around September, and I was like, there's no way. Even after a harsh start, and we had the hurricane that disrupted the schedule, there were rumors then, and I said, why? Why would he ever? Maybe one quarterback going down, one bad season. I just still didn't see the justification there. Jimbo's a liar, but I guess that's okay. It's kind of the nature of the business. Just as a Florida State fan, you're just not used to it is all. Is that kind of how you're seeing Willie Taggert? Is that a pretty fair assessment, or is there any comparison there?
I think there's an element of he was never kind of ours, and I think that probably the Jimbo South Florida, or is more of like a long-term girlfriend having a breakup. This is more just like a hot affair that I left my wife for, potentially. And I think there's some Oregon people who feel, I don't think there's that many people who are saying like, well, we should have kept Helfrich, but I think there's a lot of Oregon people who felt, well, we gave you a big chance and you totally screwed us over. That type of feeling. But now, again, flash forward a year, and the jury's massively out of Mario Cristobal, but all of the positive things I said about Willie in terms of building a program, getting energy, saying all the right things, hiring a ridiculous staff, recruiting at a level never seen before at Oregon, Cristobal is doing all of those things. Now, again, Oregon's not played a meaningful game yet this season. We'll see how he can do to actually coach the team, but he's kind of passed those tests that Taggert was also able to pass. So in terms of that metric, I think most Oregon fans have in a way moved on, and certainly took a lot of joy after that Virginia Tech game and the struggles in week 2. So in a way, we've kind of moved on, I think, as a program. And I think Oregon people also lived through the instability of Chip Kelly, where Kelly flirted with the Tampa Bay Bucks and then came back and then left the next year for the Eagles. And, I think there's a lot of scar tissue left from Oregon fans from their psyche going through that process, which a lot of that kind of hate and anger got taken out on Willie when he left.
Okay. I also didn't really realize until you put it together the coaching tree and the lineage there leading up to Chip Kelly, which is, you see a lot of stability like that. The coaching searches and the in and out that's very common now, and probably is the reality of coaching in college football going forward, could have been a bit shocking. So that's a comparison I never even thought of. So thanks for pointing that out. All right. Well, as a fan, I wanted to go back real quickly. You guys had an episode. It was last September, I believe, when you were talking about all of it was around hurricane season, and some of the games got canceled. Florida State had to move around some things, and there were some other teams that like non-conference, like UCF didn't play Georgia Tech, and people were playing away games and stuff. But you guys commented a lot about the Florida geography and not being very familiar with it, so I'll let you ask some questions.
You said Orlando, Central Florida. No idea.
Yeah, so it's about as central as you can get in the state. If you go east from Orlando, you're going to hit the coast in about an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. That's where NASA is. That's where Port Canaveral is. If you go west from Orlando, you hit Tampa in about an hour and 15. So there's...
See, in my head, I feel Tampa and Orlando are like 8 hours away.
No, hour 15. In fact, I used to have a job where I had presences Orlando and Tampa, and you could get there in 75 minutes. They're that close. But to go up from like Tallahassee to Orlando is 4 hours. Tallahassee to Miami is 8 hours. You're driving down some interstates. There's a lot of woods. There's a lot of nothing towns. There's a lot of lumber. Lumber is our second biggest export. But Pensacola to Miami are kind of the extremes of the state, if you will, if you're not counting the Florida Keys. And so that's a 12-hour drive right there. So long-wise, it makes sense that you're going to have a long trip. But if you're going coast to coast, 2.5 hours, it does a trick.
Yeah, I feel in my head it's more of a fatter state than a long state.
Okay.
Like I feel Tampa to Orlando should be about 4 to 5.
All right.
Yeah, and also like Orlando should just be on the coast. It was a weird decision to put it inland.
To put Orlando in?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you got plenty of beaches. You certainly have like Florida Atlantic is there's cool. Boca Raton is not too far from the coast. Florida International, that's like North Miami, and then it still blows my mind. This is something that some schools have, but South Florida and Miami, they don't have stadiums on their campuses.
Yeah,
they have to drive. Well, USF, I know people that are going to school there. They just bus, which that just turns into a frat party. You can just drink more. And Miami, it's a 45-minute drive, and so that's why their home games just aren't attended.
Yeah, it's a not super common here, but again, if you think Stanford, Cal, Arizona State, Washington, UCLA, USC, all of those are in major metropolitan areas where the vast majority of people attending those games are going to be people who live there. So again, it's a much more, even though it's an on-campus stadium in Stanford, it still doesn't have that campus feel like you would get if you went to Purdue or something, where literally everybody's driving from 3 hours in and we're all taking hotels, we're all there the night before. It's much more like that NFL vibe of, okay, then we drive to the game and then we go home. It's a very different feel than you get in the majority of college campuses.
Well, and you guys have the benefit of some much higher institutions of learning too. while Florida has its good share of great schools, it's certainly not the Ivy League that the Pac-12 has. So it's a lot less.
It's definitely good schools on the West Coast.
Yeah, I actually when I was in Tallahassee, I met a guy. He was from the Vanderbilt area, and he transferred in. And he said, "I never knew that people picked a school to attend by how good the football team was. Like, to him, that was just completely foreign."
Yeah, it's a classic Vandy guy answer.
Yeah. So, Well, any other thoughts you want to leave for our fans? We mostly cover Florida State, Florida. That's about 80% of the show, maybe 85%. But we also kind of whip around the state. So we cover Central Florida, South Florida, Florida Atlantic, Miami, those schools.
Well, for me, I'll just, not to be super down on Taggert, I think for me to paint the success, the way he's going to work, it's the Dabo model. I think he's a CEO type. I don't think there's enough evidence from what he's done in the past to, first, it doesn't touch the defensive side of the ball. So you got the guy from Michigan State, Barnett. I think he's done well in game one, and then game two, he gave up 500 yards passing. We'll see how he's doing. And there's a ton of rumors when Willie first got the job that he's going to bring Levitt all along. If this season goes haywire, that defensive coordinator position, it is very much, he is running that side of the ball. So that is a massive thing in terms of the success of Florida State. So again, that's something to watch, is how happy you are with the defensive side of the ball. And on top of that, I don't think he can run a program like Florida State with recruiting, with boosters, with all that other stuff, and hire a guy like Walt Ball, some no-name OC from Maryland, and expect the thing to work out well.
Walt Bell.
So I would highly suggest, or if I have a crystal ball here, Walt Ball is not going to be the OC starting next year, because the offense looks abysmal right now. I'm assuming it's not going to massively change, and the defense, I think you're committed to that. I think what he's going to have to do to fix it, assuming the season does not turn around and there's some massive improvement, the big fix that's going to be is bring in a real offensive coordinator, have Taggert kind of potentially get rid of his buddies. I know he's got his guy as the Pimpleton as the running back coach. Seemed fine, whatever. But I could see it very much cleaning house of the Willie loyalist guys from all the way back from Western Kentucky, and people in the AD pushing a real offensive coordinator. And I could actually see the model working, because in terms of recruiting, energy, all that kind of stuff, Taggert's going to be fine. And he's going to get elite talent in there. Just the simple question is he going to be good enough to coach? And the reality is 10 wins isn't going to be good enough at Florida State. You're going to have to beat Clemson. And if you don't beat Clemson, nothing probably really else matters to the fan base long term. And certainly you can't be losing to teams like Virginia Tech and Syracuse and Louisville and all those other ones, which he has not yet showed he can do. So I do think there is a path to success, but it's been a really, really dicey first two games.
Yeah. How Taggert convinced some guys from Florida to move to Oregon is impressive. By the way, you said crystal ball. Was that an intentional pun or was that accidental? Crystal ball?
It's like the classic message board start of your thread.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, back to Leavitt real quickly. We were sure that was a done deal. He coached South Florida, and I was like, oh, hey, this is great. His defenses are fantastic. And I was like, why are they not getting this done? What's happening? And I was like, oh, no, we're going to have to go search for something else. Mickey Andrews, by the way, was hired as a consultant. Maybe that has something to do with the first-year foresight he has about Barnett. I don't know.
The Leavitt thing was fascinating drama because there's pretty big rumors that he was not happy because Leavitt was going to get the head coaching job, didn't get the head coaching job. Then people just assumed that meant he was going to leave, but then decided to stay. He did the improvement of the Oregon defense last year was really impressive, especially in the context of having no support from the offensive side of the ball once Herbert got injured. So that would have been a nice hire. But again, the talent that you're able to recruit and the money Florida State should be able to pay. Again, if the resources out there to put together an elite staff, if needed. So, and I think that's going to be the tool to success in terms of for Taggart. So it's, there's plenty of examples of guys who've stubbed their toe year one, like Saban lost to Louisiana Monroe. Yeah. Kirby Smart was, it's not called god awful, but Georgia too. People forget how mediocre Georgia was. Granted, they had a true freshman quarterback, but it was they lost to Georgia Tech to end the year. It was, doesn't take too much to paint a scenario where Florida State turns it around. But there's also tons of cases where a guy looks really bad in the first 2 weeks and things don't change, and you end up with a new coach pretty quickly. So I think it's obviously massively, the jury's still out, but I think anybody drawing massive sweeping conclusions is probably a little premature, but the next 3 weeks will be pretty big for Florida State to kind of resurrect this season.
Absolutely. And actually, I kind of referenced Kirby Smart, nearly losing to Nicholls State, and then Saban losing Monroe. He actually lost to Florida State that first year, too.
Yeah.
If you're looking for the silver lining, there it is. But if you're going to go to that right away, I would pump the brakes because you shouldn't struggle against FCS team. Just hands down, no. That just can't happen.
Yeah. It does feel different. Like, it feels like those are rebuilding jobs. Georgia's probably your best comparable, I think, in terms of, a guy who came in and is going to be able to recruit really well. And the year one was just getting his feet wet, whether it was him getting his feet wet or the team getting whatever. It needed a year to kind of get going. So, but it feels like there's bigger problems. But again, it's, they could go beat Syracuse by 20 next weekend and things will feel a lot better.
Yeah, I agree. Only a 3-point favorite so far, which I understand. Their defense is completely terrible. But as I mentioned in the show, if we're beating ourselves on offense, we're not going to be able to score. So here's to looking up for that. Preseason, I had Florida State going 8-4. What were your thoughts?
I would say for me preseason, I'd actually would have probably guessed it would have been better.
I was openly a little harsh on him.
Yeah, because for me, it's pretty similar to the Oregon season in terms of how much you tribute the poor performance last to the quarterback. And, the first year, Francois was really solid. And you didn't expect what you got out of, and you expect the one side of the ball that was going to be good would have been the offense. So, and some decent pieces. So for me, the offense, I would have preseason guessed it somewhere more along the lines of loss to Clemson, maybe at Notre Dame, call it 9-10, somewhere in that range.
Okay.
I still think again, I think we'll learn a lot about the Syracuse game, but it would not shock me that they're 6-1 playing Clemson 2-3 days before Halloween. For me, a lot, if they get through Syracuse, I think Louisville's absolutely at Miami. It'll be tough. People will be into that game. That'll be a bit of a pick'em game, but it does not take a lot to resurrect this thing. But then you lose to Syracuse, then it's are you making a bowl game? So. Yeah, it's a very big game.
Yeah, I knew that Virginia Tech, maybe NC State were kind of toss-up games preseason, and so if you're able to recover and win NC State, then you come into you're going to beat Wake Forest. By the way, out of the end of the Wake Forest game, we're going to have T-Pain performing. That's a new thing Taggart brought in his concerts.
Oh yeah. And the backpack's such a nice ad.
Well, is that the right adjective for that? It's the history of that is it. Put it in the bag. I just imagine if that had come out against Virginia Tech. Oh my God.
Yeah. There's always something that just feels forced with Taggert, which, it gets magnified when you bounce from a place after year one, and then all these quotes and all this stuff. It just feels pretty fake, which is all solved if you win, but if you don't win, it really doesn't look good.
Which is why we put up with Saban's temper,
Yeah,
because he wins.
Absolutely, yeah. Belichick, same thing.
Yep. Florida Gators. Any prediction win-loss this year?
I'll say I like Mullen. I think I compare him a lot to Chris Peterson. Talked about it on our show. I feel he's a very high floor guy, and by I mean that once he gets the thing going, are you going to always be competing for a national championship? I don't know, but you'll be sitting pretty consistently at that 9-win plateau. And considering post Meyer Florida, that's been a massive. That would be a massive win. So are you going to consistently be able to beat Georgia and go on those games to the side of the division and beat those teams? I don't know, but I think when Mullen gets it going, he should be good. And what I like when he's an offensive guy and he's it's not maybe call him a quarterback whisperer, but he's been able to develop quarterbacks, which something the SEC for some reason I have no idea, but just simply cannot do. Mm-hmm. And I'm very confident Felipe Franks is not the guy, so I think this year might be pretty messy. But for me, Florida feels more like that team that year two is going to take a pretty big step forward, and I don't necessarily feel that way with Florida State. But is he a guy who's going to get you over the finish line to make to the playoffs? I don't quite know, but is he going to take Florida back to respectability? I feel pretty confident he's going to be able to do that. In terms of this year, I just don't see the personnel there. Certainly from the quarterback position and the skill positions, I just don't see it. Again, unless they're going to kind of play Muschamp ball and just grind out games here and there. And I still think the SEC East is pretty, like, once you get by Georgia, Missouri's got a nice quarterback. That's about it. So it's like Kentucky's probably your number 2 team right now. Potentially it's pretty slim. So I still think Florida has a decent season. And I still think moving forward, they're clear number 2. Against Georgia, and I think we'll have some pretty fun cocktail parties deciding that SEC East. So,
yeah, it might be some parity there after all. I think my co-host Chris, he's pretty on board with 7-8 wins.
Yeah.
South Carolina looked like a toss-up game, but also Kentucky looked like a sure win. So who knows going forward?
For me, I wouldn't get super hyper for me the issue with Florida, and I've only kind of monitored it slightly because Oregon went head-to-head with their recruit with Florida recently. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Florida's recruiting is not necessarily right now at the level that most Florida fans would want, and that's certainly something that might take some adjustment. Again, I compared this to Chris Peterson because when Peterson went from Boise to Washington, it took a little bit of an adjustment of, well, I could do it with these Boise kids. I can do it at Washington. No, you got to go out there and you got to go to LA, get these elite LA kids, convince them to come to Washington. There might be a little bit of that. Mullins, in terms of you're going to have to get some recruiting specialist guys in there to just pump up recruiting. But I think those program things. This is a guy who had Mississippi State pretty competitive for a decade. I'm confident he'll figure it out at Florida. So,
yeah. I think the struggle would be just who he's recruiting against. I mean, Florida is a hotbed of talent. We all know that. But you got Taggert, who's right 2 hours away, is going to start stealing a lot of guys. I saw some guy in the media joking that he almost stole some recruits his first year from Mullen. It happened that quickly. And then you got Miami, who's seemingly at home with Mark Richt, and they're going to have success there. Obviously, you're going to see some drop off from last year to this year with with a turnover chain, and I'm so sick of that crap. Anyway, but their defense is really good, so I have no reason to believe that they're still not going to be the favorite in the Coastal. I'll still give it a month to see if Vatek's actually for real. And I mean, they're going to be 5-0 and deceptively good, but their only good win, quote unquote, is Florida State at that point because they have a pretty weak schedule up to that point. Yeah. So. Miami, I had probably 9 or 10 wins. Is that kind of where you had them at too, Canada?
Yeah, somewhere. Like Miami, for me, it's an odd team because in a way last year you felt, it's so easy to say, okay, they're back. But then you go through their schedule. Like, where was, we all remember the victory against Notre Dame, a Notre Dame victory that completely did not hold up as year went away. Obviously, the victory against Florida, they almost lost to Florida State. And then the wheels just fell off. You lost to a bad Pitt team, got blown up by Clemson, and Wisconsin did, pretty easily won that game. So, like, it was a season where it felt really good that Miami was back, but I still don't really know much about them. But the reality is the Coastal is just pretty crappy. And when potentially your second hardest game in your division is Duke, it's hard for me not to predict that the Coastal's still going to go through that game against Miami versus Vodtech will probably decide it.
Yeah. Weak is an understatement for how bad the Coastal is. I would say 4 of the worst teams in the conference are right there, which is why Florida State this year just crapped out on the dice roll, because we play Syracuse. That's probably the only team that we're like, you're probably not bowl eligible in the conference schedule.
Yeah.
So, all right. Any thoughts on any of the other schools? UCF and Orlando, Bulls, South Florida?
I'm not. I hated the hire by Central Florida. I boggles my mind why you think Josh Heupel's going to.
It's a simple formula I'm seeing here. You hire a quarterback who won a national championship. There you go.
I just don't get it. It's just, okay, Drew Lock's a nice quarterback, and they put up some big yards in a bunch of games that didn't matter, and that's a crazy hire. This is a guy who could not make it work at Oklahoma with Oklahoma talent, and Stoops had to fire him to think that he's going to be the answer. That I am very confident it's not going to work out well. I again, Charlie Strong, I feel he's going to probably be, again, a very similar. The floor on Charlie Strong will be pretty high. I think Central Florida bottoms out and it gets bad and Heupel gets fired. I could see Strong being a guy consistently near the top of the AAC, but not really getting over, doing just fine. And I love Kiffin. I think Kiffin's going to be great. I think if I was running an SEC program, I'd hire Lane Kiffin. The fact Arkansas didn't hire Lane Kiffin is crazy to me. And it's just there's some baggage there, but what he did at Florida Atlantic was incredibly impressive. You go back to his resume, he still did pretty nice things at USC. Incredibly quick hook considering what some other teams have, the leash other coaches have gotten. So I'm a big Kiffin guy. Obviously, the end will happen relatively quick. If not this year, potentially next year. So I think as long as Kiffin's there, Florida Atlantic's in great shape to win their conference.
All right, very good. We won't bother with FIU. There's really nothing to talk about. I like Butch Davis. He did some good stuff.
Yeah, there you
Miami,
go.
But we don't spend much time on them. You squeak out Old Dominion wins. There's just really not much to say about your program.
Yep.
So
take what you can get.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thanks again, Cannon, for being on the show. Any last thoughts?
Not a problem. I still think, as much as Florida and Florida State fans have to, and Miami, same thing can be said about them, is that as much as the success is not really, Florida State had the national championship and playoff berth, but the success in the last 10, 15 years have not necessarily been up to expectations. I still think they're both 3 programs that have the potential to win a national championship. And there's probably only about 15 to 20 of those in college football. And even a program like Oregon had to, hire a dream coach that all worked out perfectly. And it was hard to hold on to him. And even getting back there, everything really has to fall into place, perfectly well. So as much as it's one of those things where, success is nowhere near guaranteed ever. But I can tell you, Virginia, winning a national championship, Virginia is pretty much never going to happen. But if you put the right guy at a place like Miami, Florida, or Florida State, you certainly have that possibility, which is something to just kind of hold on to. And during the lean years, eventually it'll come.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, you have to have sustained success and get the favor of really the media bias. You have to have ESPN to sell into your program. You have to have the voters on your side, and that's. I liked what you said about. Peterson at Washington. That's kind of what he had to do. He had to go out and he had to make it happen. Bobby Bowden, when he first came to Florida State, they were a girls' school until the mid-'40s. You had to build up the brand. You had to go on the road and play all these impossibly hard teams to start getting people to know who you were. And that's not going to be a short-term thing. I'm on the opinion that if UCF were to get the right coach in and you have consistent success in a conference like the American, 20 years down the road, if you're winning 10 games a year, that could be something you could work toward. South Florida too.
If they fell into a Power 5 conference, just that the chasm between the schedule is going to be, in the current landscape, almost impossible to get to a playoffs, unless, like Houston that 1 year had the schedule where they had Oklahoma and Louisville, who were both top 10 teams, and they weren't able to navigate the whole schedule. But it needs to be one of those years where you have an elite group of 5 team, but it just happens that year they also have a schedule which potentially could get them there. But who knows what the landscape will be? Who knows if the Big Ten needs a school or two? And one of those, it would not be shocking.
Yeah.
Maybe the ACC comes calling if the world needs to have 16 teams at some point, and that's you just never know.
Yeah. Geographically,
the zoo would be in the in the ACC or in the SEC. So.
Let alone the East Division. Why would you put them on that side? It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, geographically, the ACC will benefit from that. Also, the Tampa-Orlando TV market is huge, and usually when you're selling TV packages, money is the biggest reason you would bring in a school. Also, the ACC decided about 5 years ago that they want to be a basketball conference, number one, and that kind of hurts your chances with football. So that's why you take the likes of Louisville and Syracuse, and you're going to be stuck with middle-tier football programs pretty much forever.
Yeah.
So...
Because the upside of both Central Florida, South Florida versus a Syracuse, Boston College, UConn back in the day, the discussion, even a Louisville, it's massive. Even right now, Central Florida is a better program than BC has a nice team this year, but the Syracuse, the Dukes, the Wake Forests of the world, nobody's getting booted from a conference right now, but they do have something to add certainly, but it's just. They're going to be stuck where they are until they get let in, and then you're TCU, and TCU got let in, and they're really the one kind of true maybe you could call Louisville, but true mid-major who was able to sneak into the Power Conference, and it definitely changed their outlook moving forward.
Yeah, and what did it take? Coaching, sustainability. Gary Patterson. I actually picked TCU to win the Big 12 this year, believe it or not. I like their special teams with Turpin and. I don't know that they're going to beat Ohio State this week, but I've just never trusted a team like Oklahoma years 1 to 2 under a new coach when you have a drop off from Mayfield. But it's looking more and more wrong about that as the games progress.
Yeah, but it's every year. It's every year. Week 6 feels like there's going to be 4 undefeated teams, and usually there's maybe 1. That's usually about it. Yeah. Maybe 0, maybe 2 at the absolute most. So, like all those one-loss teams, eventually somebody will come back to the pack. It always happens. It's just very difficult to navigate a 12-game schedule in college football. Yep. So there'll be the losses there.
Yeah, very good. All right, Ken. Well, I can't thank you enough. Do you want to tell my fans how they can find your show? Yeah,
it's the College Football Podcast. Anywhere in the world where you can get a podcast downloaded, hit us up on Twitter, the College Football Podcast. Give us a listen. Appreciate the time very much. It's been fun.
Yeah, Kenna, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.